What's up everyone, it's Endymion. Today I want to speak about how Microsoft went from being the dominant leader of the industry to what it is today and how it got there. This video will be full of harsh truths and hot takes, but before you crucify me, I hope you will listen and come to understand just how Xbox has failed. So let's begin. In the early 2000s, Xbox was considered the juggernaut of the gaming landscape, with blockbuster titles like Gears of War, BioShock, Mass Effect, and Halo all being exclusive to Microsoft's platform originally. The 360 era of Xbox was so dominant in fact that it was borderline inconceivable to fathom a world where Xbox wasn't leading the charge. After all, the Xbox brand was created by Microsoft as their massive push into the video games industry. And I would say the golden age of Xbox were between the years of 2007 to 2013. In this 6-year period, while their competitors like Sony and Nintendo were still doing their own thing, Xbox was in a league of its own. It had better multiplayer infrastructure than its rivals. It also ushered in the age of indie games with its revolutionary program called Xbox Arcade as well. To put it simply, Xbox was on top. I mean, Halo 3, which I consider to be probably the most feature-complete AAA game ever released, solidified Xbox's dominance in this period. Nothing could stop them. That was until 2013. During this time in late 2012 to early 2013, both Microsoft and Sony were getting ready to present their next consoles to the world. And if I had to pinpoint the exact moment the console war shifted, it would be on one fateful night. It was June 10th, 2013, and it was the day the industry would change. Xbox as a brand had grown fat on its success, bringing in insane cash and catering to millions of fans across the world. Microsoft, in their greed, thought they could do no wrong and envisioned a future where Microsoft and their brands would focus less on video games and exclusives and more on television and locking software behind accounts. If you don't know, when you buy a game brand new, the money from that sale gets divided between the retailer as well as the publisher and so on. So when you bought Halo 3 new, for example, Microsoft gets a lot of money from that. But when a game is sold used, since it was already sold initially, the used copy's profits would technically be free to go to the retailer fully and not the publisher. So a used copy of Halo 3 that would sell for $30 would technically make a place like GameStop more money in the long run than selling you a brand new copy of Halo 3 for $60, if that makes sense. So in order to combat this loophole, Microsoft decided to add a security measure to their software so when you buy a game new, that disc would have a one-time use code that would make your Xbox the only Xbox that could play that disc. And say your friend wanted to borrow your game, they could, but they would need to essentially pay full price to unlock a code so that your disc would run in their Xbox. To anyone on the younger side right now watching this, I can imagine what I'm saying sounds absolutely insane to you. I mean, paying full price to play a game your friend lent you? Why would they do this? Well, the answer was to eliminate the used game market so retailers like GameStop and so on couldn't profit off products made and paid for by Microsoft. And as you can imagine, this went about as smooth as you'd expect, with millions of Xbox fans saying Microsoft's vision for their new console, the Xbox One, was anti-consumer and predatory, which I agree. Anyway, now that you know that, let's get back to that fateful day of June 10th, 2013. This was the day Xbox decided to push their new console with the focus on being your cable box as well as having more emphasis on TV than, playing video games. Later on that day, however, is what I consider to be the single most important E3 press conference in the history of the video games industry. Sony would come on stage that same night and announce that not only was their new console, the PlayStation 4, going to be easier to develop for, have PS Plus members be able to access their games at no additional cost, they announced that you could play used games and would not require an internet connection to verify your console every 24 hours like the Xbox One would need. Basically, in this moment, Sony said to the audience that they were not going in the direction of their direct competitor and would instead embrace the old traditions that gamers were used to. You could say in a way, Sony really didn't do anything new here, but the simple fact they prioritized player financial freedom over the anti-consumer chokehold Microsoft was trying to force on their consumer base would lead to catastrophic circumstances for not only Microsoft, but Xbox as a brand. Overnight, the cultural zeitgeist changed, with many denouncing Microsoft and the Xbox brand as anti-gamer, and Sony in this moment would solidify their dominance as the most profitable and powerful console ecosystem the world would ever see. Well, so far anyway. I mean, who doesn't remember the most savage advertisement in gaming history? Here, watch.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
In literally one single night, the goodwill and power that Microsoft had wrestled from its competition was stolen in its entirety. It was like the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, except blue, cause, Sony likes the color blue, I guess. After this decisive victory on Sony's part, Xbox as a brand wouldn't recover for years. Not only was it a failure when it came to sales, but the PS4 would go on to meteoric success. And as of June 2022, the Xbox One has sold around 50 million units. Which may seem like a lot, however, the PS4 as of June 2022 had surpassed 117 million units sold, doubling and then some the Xbox. As if this colossal failure of a generation for Microsoft could go any worse, the Xbox One would go on to limp through the years, with Sony hitting home run after home run with incredible releases that would redefine the video game landscape while winning hordes of awards from everyone. Hey, that rhymed. Nice. To put it into Dragon Ball Z terms, Sony was Goku, always evolving and surpassing their competition, all while having fun doing it. Nintendo was like Beerus, in a league of its own, basking in its own greatness, not really competing or caring what anyone else was doing. And Microsoft was like Vegeta, with a hint of Yamcha, if I'm being honest. Every time Microsoft would manage to get some new form, Sony would find a way to surpass it and steal the scene. For the entirety of the PS4 Xbox One generation, I think it's fair to say that Microsoft was living in the shadow of their rivals, and there was no surpassing them. It actually got so dire for Microsoft that at one point they even considered selling off the Xbox division because it simply could not compete with PlayStation. Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, even said, and I quote, "Then the question is, do we go forward with Xbox?" Spencer said. "Because we're getting really outsold by PlayStation in the market at this point. Do we stay invested in it, or do we make a different decision?" End quote. This entire screw-up by the lack of leadership and corporate greed led to one of the ballsiest and forward-thinking ideas Xbox had ever conceived. Spencer would announce a new service called Xbox Game Pass, and if I'm being honest here, this decision is the only reason why Xbox still exists at all. Game Pass would give players access to hundreds of games to stream or download for a monthly fee. It's like Netflix but for video games, but while this move was good, it revealed another massive failure on Microsoft's part that became ever more exposed as time went on. And I'm just going to say it straight and not sugarcoat it, but Xbox doesn't have the strongest first-party lineup. In fact, I would say it has the weakest of the big three, and it's not even close. And don't get mad at me for saying that. Hell, Phil Spencer even agrees with this. When it comes to taking care of and cultivating their devs and franchises, I would say no one does it better than Nintendo or Sony. Both companies seem extremely capable in making sure their first-party studios deliver successful games on a yearly rotation to ensure their consumer base stays happy and engaged. But when it comes to Xbox, it's the opposite. Look, I'll give you that maybe outside of Forza, which is easily Xbox's most consistent first-party franchise, everything else seems to be a freaking mess, and that's putting it lightly. Gears of War, for example, while doing fine, is just that. It's fine. It's not great or setting the world on fire like the original trilogy did on the 360. Then we have other mismanaged franchises like Fable, who hasn't had an actual new game since Fable 3, which was 12 years ago at this point. I know some people will say, well, what about Fable The Journey? That's a Fable game, but it's not a true Fable game, guys. Come on, be serious. That's like saying Resident Evil Resistance is a Resident Evil game. Like, yeah, okay it is, but like, come on, that's not a Resident Evil game. That's a piece of crap. You get what I'm saying. It's not a true game. It's like a weird tech demo with a price slapped on it. I mean, the newest Fable game is nowhere near being done because Microsoft is apparently hellbent on using in-game engines that they own over stable engines like Unreal, for example. Then there's Halo, who originally was the main topic of this video for me, but as I sat here naked on my couch staring into infinity, I realized that Halo wasn't a failure, but a symptom of a larger problem plaguing Microsoft. You see, Halo is so horribly mismanaged at this point, I actually can't imagine it getting any worse than it is right now. After Bungie left to make Destiny and getting bought by Sony no less for $3 billion, Microsoft would create a studio to solely shepherd the Halo franchise in the form of 343 Industries. And again, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you, but 343 Industries is trash. They somehow managed to release not one, but 3 less than stellar Halo games, as well as managing to screw up a remastered collection of older games that wouldn't even run properly for over a year after release. How the hell is a developer so incompetent that they are literally given full feature-complete games like Halo 1, 2, and 3, and still can't manage to release them and have them work at launch? Sure, they work now, years later, but come on. 343 would end up being so bad at managing Halo that fans would eventually start a digital witch hunt and demand that they be taken off the franchise. Things got so bad with Infinite's release that the head of 343, Bonnie Ross, would announce her departure and say she was leaving due to a family health issue. Sure, we believe you, Bonnie. You just so happen to leave the studio that gamers want to burn down for bastardizing their favorite franchise, and it's because of a family health issue? Who's the family member? Jesus Christ himself? If they're gonna come up with excuses, at least make it somewhat believable. I could go on and keep pointing out how Microsoft studios are mismanaged and seem to keep failing at releasing good games. Like, remember that quadruple A studio they made called The Initiative that's apparently making a Perfect Dark reboot? The same studio that keeps losing devs at a record pace? Yeah, it's all a big mess. And I know there's people already commenting saying, well, what about Bethesda? What about games like Fallout, Elder Scrolls, and Doom? Microsoft owns them now, right? Here's the thing. While Microsoft has technically bought Activision Blizzard, the deal is not finalized, and even if it does go through, which apparently is having all kinds of backlash, Microsoft didn't make those games technically. They just bought them while they so happen to be making those games already. This actually leads me to my next major failure for Xbox and Microsoft as a whole, and that's that Microsoft doesn't seem to know how to manage or cultivate their own talent. They're kind of like a rich kid whose dad gave them money to start a business, and Richie Boy decides to buy a club, and instead of hiring competent people, he instead hires a bunch of his friends, and Richie Boy can't seem to understand why his business isn't doing well. All while failing to understand that in order to run a business, you need people who know what they're doing, and not assume that just by throwing money at every problem that it will just magically fix everything. Because sure, Microsoft has money. I mean, they have a lot of money. But the reality is that as a brand, when it comes to their exclusives, Xbox just lacks identity. And instead of fostering what's already there, Phil Spencer and his Microsoft buddies instead think it's better to just keep bloating up their Xbox brand by buying up more companies, instead of actually fixing the underlying problems that plague their already existing studios and partnerships. Xbox is truly all quantity and very little quality these days. Sure, you can subscribe to Game Pass and get tons of games, but a lot of what you're getting is either games from Xbox's golden years, when they were actually competent, or new releases like High on Life, which is fine, I guess, but it's not exactly a system seller. Of course, Game Pass does get a lot of decent or even good games at release too, but the fact remains that when it comes to making their brand stronger, they don't seem to know how to do it organically. I'll let Colin Moriarty of Last Stand Media explain this. Here's Colin talking about Sony's approach versus Microsoft's approach to gaming and why the Activision deal is a problem. Here, listen.
From the outside, the biggest things that they ever did were buying a few studios, the Bungie acquisition recently. The Gaikai deal over 10 years ago is so quaint. It was $350 million for that. And it went nowhere, obviously. So the few things that they've tried to like kind of buy their way in, it hasn't worked. They've realized they've built their things slowly and over time. That might not matter to regulators and it might not matter to the consumer, but it is an argument that Sony can make that I think is accurate and valid to say, we are a much smaller company with a much smaller footprint than our competitor. Both of our competitors in some sense in the gaming space and in the ability to kind of draw people in, and Microsoft's case to be able to withstand losses. And even through all of that, including the PS3 era when we were on our back and it fucked badly, we survived. We didn't survive by buying shit. We survived by making great games. So why can't they do that? And that is an argument. And I think it's a legitimate one. And I think they can go back and say, well, you can look at us in our acquisition of certain studios that we've worked with that we can defend and that are easily defended, I think, that are also much smaller. But they can also say, look at the behavior of Microsoft since the very beginning. What did Microsoft do when they started the Xbox? They tried to buy Nintendo, right? We discussed that on the show. They literally tried to buy Nintendo. Then they buy Halo and put that as an exclusive on their platform. And they buy Rare and ruin it for 2 generations.
Gears.
Gears of War, right? From an outside, on the outside, then they end up bringing that in. They lose the studio. They own the IP. It's a complicated thing with Epic. There's not to say there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if that's the way you want to do it. It's just that that's a bad look when you're competing against a studio that, or a family of studios and a brand that frankly didn't do it that way.
And I have to agree with Colin here. Microsoft just doesn't take the time or care to actually build up their studios. They'd rather buy the restaurant that makes their favorite pizza, but then refuse to actually learn what goes into making that pizza. And when those that know leave, that's how you get a 343 Halo scenario. The pizza is an analogy, in case you're wondering, for making video games. Anyway, if we're being honest, the entire concept of an Xbox is kind of pointless these days to begin with. You don't even need an Xbox to play Game Pass, you can just use your PC, making the actual physical fridge of a console even less needed when you think about it. Ultimately, Xbox as a brand is still strong, yes, but this is less because of its quality and more to do with how Microsoft is capable and willing to withstand losses to overthrow and consume their competition. Sony is massive, but they also take the time and care to cultivate their studios and make them the best in the business. Nintendo is Nintendo. Well, besides Game Freak and Pokemon being lazy, and Microsoft is just a greedy monolith that thinks money will solve everything. After all, the Game Awards just happened where Sony and Nintendo games won big, and Microsoft was woefully absent not only from the awards but had no major exclusive reveals either. And it's even more hilarious because the Game Awards is hosted in none other than the Microsoft Theater. Like, come on. In the end, Xbox as a brand will keep existing solely due to the financial might of Microsoft as a company. But it's also a brand that lacks true identity, real exclusives, and devalues the worth of true premium gaming by throwing it all behind a paywall where you don't own anything. But hey, it might make you happy for a bit, I guess. If you like Xbox, cool, I'm happy for you. But as a fan who used to love the days of Halo 3 and Mass Effect, Xbox is nothing but a shadow of its former self these days. A bloated giant full of garbage trying to desperately consume everything in existence until it all inevitably implodes one day. And while Xbox may be profitable finally, it can't be understated that at its core, the Xbox is indeed Microsoft's greatest failure.